Do you think it's connected with the development of a language, the formation of memories? Does it correspond to where the brain starts to grasp?
A lot is being learned about language acquisition. The more intensively the topic is studied, the more sophisticated the research techniques, the more we learn that children know quite a lot of language, much more than you would expect, before they can exhibit any of that knowledge. The direct evidence about this, and there's also indirect evidence. So just to mention some of the indirect evidence, there is a technique of teaching language to the deaf-blind. Actually, my wife did a lot of work on this. It's called the Tadoma method.
It's with the hand.
Well, what they do is teach the person to put their hand on someone's face, and using the motions of the face and the vocal cords to interpret what you're saying. Extremely little, very little information comes through, but people get a very satisfactory knowledge of language from that. I mean, so much so that you have to do pretty complex tests to see what they don't know. However, they have never succeeded in using this method for people who lost sight and hearing before about 18 months old. What seems to be the case is that during the early exposure, where the child is not manifesting very much knowledge, maybe producing a word or two-word sentences, they're acquiring the basic character of the language, quite a lot of knowledge, which they can then build on when it's unconscious, of course, but they can build on it when they get this later instruction, which has very little evidence. And they can, in fact, live in a society where people are talking and they can understand what they're saying if they can put their hand on your face. In fact, I should say that, one of the most striking things about language, which has really not been studied, just consider an infant, a one-day-old infant. The infant, there's all kind of things going on in the world. How does the infant figure out what part of what's going on in the world has to do with language? It's an incredible feat. No other organism can do it.
I know, you know what?
Actually, there's, when you think about it, as we started to do from the 50s, there's an evolutionary basis for this, too. Language is a very curious phenomenon. I mean, one question we ought to be puzzled with, two questions, is why are there any languages at all? And another one is, why are there so many? If you go back, say, 50,000 years, both of those questions were answered, because that's when our ancestors left Africa, and there's been no relevant cognitive change since. So children everywhere in the world have the same capacity for language acquisition. So the questions were finished by about 50,000 years ago. And if you go back very shortly before that, like maybe 100,000 years ago, the questions were answered because there weren't any languages. From an evolutionary point of view, that's the flick of an eye.
How do you have this record? Because obviously it's fossil.
That comes from paleoanthropology.
The tools they make.
We know the fossil record. We know the record of creation of artifacts and so on. And it's pretty well recognized that there was a sudden explosion, sometimes called the Great Leap Forward, roughly in that period, maybe 75,000 years ago. You can argue tens of thousands of years, it doesn't matter much. From an evolutionary point of view, it's an instant. So somewhere in that instant, some small hunter-gatherer group, could have been a couple of thousand people, you suddenly find a burst of creative activity, complex tools, recording natural phenomena, more complex family structures, symbolic representation, art and so on. From an evolutionary point of view, it's an instant. Now, it's generally assumed that, and it's hard to think of an alternative, that instant must be the time when language suddenly appeared, because language is required for all these things. Before there could have been, primitive communication systems like every animal has. But human language, with the property I just mentioned, the capacity for thought, constructing in your head. When you walk around, you're talking to yourself.
Yeah.
You can't stop. It takes a real act of will not to talk to yourself. And what you're doing is thinking, basically. Recollecting, or whatever it is, but you're making use constantly of this capacity to construct an unbounded array of structured expressions which have a meaning and a sound. And that's the core of our ability to create, to invent, plan, interpret, and so on. Well, that must have happened right about that time. But if it happened suddenly, it has to be simple. There's no time. In evolutionary time, that's nothing, remember, which means that some small thing must have happened, some small mutation probably in one, and a mutation is in one person, it's not in a group, suddenly gave that person the capacity to this capacity. Well, that person was unique in the animal world. It could plan, it could think, it could interpret, and so on. But if that happened, and there's no pressures on that system, no selection or other pressures. It just appeared. Well, if it just appeared, it's going to be perfect. It's going to be like a snowflake. It just follows from natural law. That's what appears. Like a snowflake is what it is. It doesn't evolve.
In one of your books from the 70s, you give this example of the sentence, the man who is tall is in the room, and how the child naturally can postulate the question. And I was wondering if you could explain just quickly, because I could do a very nice animation from that.
This is a simple question, and it's interesting that it never bothered anyone. It's a little bit like for 2,000 years, scientists were satisfied with simple explanation for an obvious fact. If you take an apple and you detach it from a tree, it's going to go down. If you take steam, it's going to go up. So 2,000 years, the answer was, well, they're going to their natural place. End of discussion. As soon as people started getting puzzled about that, like Galileo and Newton, then you have modern science. This is the same. Take the sentence that you gave me, the man who is tall is happy, or whatever it is. If you want to form a question from that, you take the word is and you put it in the front. So is the man who is tall happy? Right? That's the question. You don't take the first occurrence of is. You don't take the closest one to the front and say, is the man who tall is happy? That's gibberish. How does it, why? Why doesn't the child do the simple thing? Take the first occurrence of is and put it in front. That's computationally, that's much easier than finding the main occurrence, which requires knowing the phrases and so on. But it's an inconceivable error. No child has ever made that error. And it's the same in all, the minor variations. The same principle holds in all languages. So why? Well, there's some interesting explanations for why. But this is a good example of the brute force approach. In computational cognitive science, where they, as a matter of principle, want to believe that the mind is essentially empty.
The man who is tall is happy. The man who is tall is happy. The man who is tall is happy.
Then Noam took my pen and wrote the following sentence.
Look, there are serious questions about it. Like, take the man who is tall is happy. This is a predicate. This is the subject, okay? And this is sort of the main element, that's the main element of the whole sentence. And that's the one that structurally is closest to the middle, to the beginning. This one is more remote from the beginning structurally, because you have to work through this whole business, okay? So structurally speaking, this is the closest to the front. Linearly, this is the closest to the front. Now the question is, why do you use structural proximity and not linear proximity? And it's not just this case, it's everything, every language, every construction.
Is that the evidence of the studentative grammar?
Well, that's the data. And there is a principle. I mean, the principle is keep to minimal structural distance. Okay, now where does that come from? This part is probably just a law of nature. Computation tries to do things in the simplest way. But the structural distance part is a fact about language. I mean, you could have minimal computation if you did it this way. In that case, what we would say is the man who tall is happy. The child picks structural closeness because that's a property of language, probably genetically determined. Yeah, but that's about all there is to it.
The man who is tall is happy.
Yes, the man who is tall is very happy.
He's the man tall is happy. He's the man who is tall happy. He's the man who is tall happy. He's the man who tall is happy. He's the man who is tall happy. He's the man who tall is happy.